My name is Gabriel Melendez, Director of the Center for Regional Studies at the University of New Mexico. I would like to welcome you all to one of our programs in the La Canoa Legacy Series, a partnership between the National Hispanic Cultural Center and the Center for Regional Studies. The Center for Regional Studies is dedicated to the creation and dissemination of knowledge about New Mexico, the Greater Southwest as a region, and its connections to northern Mexico, Latin America, and the Iberian Peninsula. The La Canoa Legacy Series takes its inspiration from the word canoa. A canoa is a sloop-rigged fishing boat, common in the Amazon, but in New Mexico it is the name of some common everyday tools, a simple canal or flute, or the wooden paddle a baker uses to move loaves of bread in and out of a hot oven. Always La Canoa receives and transports people and resources. And we want these talks to transport us and move the conversation between presenters and audience members back and forth in rich dialogue. We also want our talks to bring practical, useful information to community members, researchers, and others interested in the history, culture, politics, sociology, and religious experiences of our region.
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank the La Canoa Organizing Committee and the staff and administration of the National Hispanic Cultural Center for inviting me here today. It's always an honor to present. I was joking earlier, I feel a little bit like a Saturday Night Live host. This is, I think, my third Canoa talk, and it's always a pleasure to be here. And I love getting to talk with the community about the type of research that we do at UNM, especially research and things that have to do with New Mexico. I'd like to thank Ana Uremovich and Valerie Martinez in particular for their support for many projects and for the Canoa series, of course, particularly. Thank you to Professor Melendez for introducing me, and thank you to the audience who's joining us here today. So welcome to the introductory talk of the 2020 portion of the La Canoa Research Series. Today, I will be talking about renowned nuevomexicana Mujerota Nina Otero-Warren, who was born near her family's home in La Constancia near Belen in 1881. And this picture is from, I sort of explained where all these pictures come from, but I imagine it's quite hard to see on the screen. All of the pictures are from the New Mexico Digital Repository. You can go online and find them. You can download them. You can look up your family members. You can look up maps. You can look up all sorts of interesting stuff. This is a picture of Nina Otero-Warren that's housed in the Palace of the Governor's Photo Archives in Santa Fe. But you can find it on the New Mexico Digital Repository in case you want to go and noodle around on your computer and find some images yourself. Otero-Warren is our subject today in part because 2020 marks the Centennial del Sufragio del Voto Femenino, the 100-year anniversary of women's right to vote. Nina Otero-Warren, in addition to her many, many other remarkable accomplishments, was an active advocate in New Mexico for women's suffrage, as well as the first Hispana in the U.S. to run for national office. Today we will be talking about her suffrage work, her candidacy for Congress, and a bit about her book, Old Spain and Our Southwest, which was published in 1936 and is how I got to know her. I always like to explain how I got to know my research topics, and it was through Old Spain and Our Southwest in the case of Nina Otero-Warren. Otero-Warren's biography is usually prefaced by her family's long and eminent political history in New Mexico. A descendant of the Luna and Otero families from the Rio Bajo, Otero-Warren was born to Eloisa Luna, whose family traced its history in New Mexico to the Oñate expedition, and Manuel B. Otero, whose father, Manuel Antonio Otero, had purchased half of the Baca land grant in Estancia. His brother Miguel bought the other half. Together, Eloisa and Manuel B. had 3 children, Eduardo, Nina, and Manuel. However, Manuel was born a month after his father's death at the hands of an American land grant squatter and millionaire, James Whitney, who shot Manuel B. in the neck as he asked Whitney to leave lands that were Otero's by use and under legal dispute. While the wounded Whitney was speared away by his family members, then redirected to trial in Valencia County, then let out on bail by a judge who let Whitney leave for California, Eloisa, who was 19 years old and pregnant, welcomed her husband's corpse. Whitney was later acquitted for Manuel B. Otero's death. Though certainly the topic of its own presentation, there are several folk songs treating the events leading up to Manuel B. Otero's death, including an indita detailing the events of the confrontation, documented by Donald Chavez Gilbert and Enrique Lamadrid, as well as songs by Casimiro Luján of Torreón, and another by Plácido Romero of Peralta, which were documented by Otero-Warren's friend, Erna Ferguson, that tell the tragic and unjust events of Otero-Warren's childhood. And in the song by Plácido Romero of Peralta, the protagonist Whitney is from Texas, right? Because you can't be more evil than if you're from Texas. Unless you just get your degree there, then that doesn't count, right? Okay, Eloisa, herself a mujerota, gave birth to her son Manuel a month after his father's death and later remarried, having 9 children with her husband Alfred Bergere. One of Otero-Warren's half-sisters, Estela Bergere, married the conservationist Aldo Leopold, author of the Sand County Almanac, and of course the trail that bears his name is just a little ways up from here along the Bosque. Otero-Warren's family moved from Los Lunas to Santa Fe, and Otero-Warren, who had long been supported by her family's nanny, Mary Elizabeth Doyle, or Teta, attended school, first at St. Vincent's Academy in Albuquerque and then Maryville College in St. Louis, returning home in her teenage years. After many years of informal political involvement with her family in Santa Fe, as her cousin Miguel A. Otero served as territorial governor, Nina Otero met U.S. Cavalry officer Rawson D. Warren at a party in Albuquerque in 1907, and in 1908 they were married in Santa Fe, moving to Fort Wingate shortly after. Otero-Warren soon discovered that her husband had a partner and 2 children living in the Philippines, and this, combined with her general dissatisfaction with Army wife life, ended her marriage. She returned to her family in Santa Fe, where she was thereafter referred to as the widow Nina Otero-Warren. Okay. She began to engage in civic and political organizations in Santa Fe, including suffrage organizations, including the Child Welfare Department in Santa Fe. And when, in 1907, prior to New Mexico becoming a state, property rights were seized from women in New Mexico by new American laws imposed on the territory, Nina ensured that she and her sisters were financially taken care of by trusts established from her mother Eloisa's estate. By the time Otero-Warren was in her mid-30s, she had become a significant figure in a variety of public offices in New Mexico and had taken on leadership roles, including superintendent of public schools for Santa Fe County. She was therefore targeted by national organizations, including the National American Women's Suffrage Association and the Congressional Union, to organize and advocate for women's right to vote. Many other states had, by 1915, granted women state-level right to vote, but New Mexico had not done so, and movement nationally to amend the Constitution, guaranteeing women the federal right to vote, was in full swing. Otero-Warren was already involved with the National Association of Women's Clubs, I know it's hard to keep track of all these different organizations, which had also lobbied unsuccessfully for women's right to vote using less overtly political approaches. Otero-Warren soon became a primary point of articulation between national suffrage organizations, in particular the Congressional Union, and the ground game in New Mexico for organizing and lobbying elected officials to weigh in positively on women's right to vote. Otero-Warren's effort in this regard are a field of ongoing study, as they have not been really seriously considered since Charlotte Whaley's biography of Otero-Warren. Present-day literary critics and historians are re-examining the conversation about suffrage movement across the United States in light of the centenary, and Otero-Warren's name, of course, emerges as a vital voice in the movement. In New Mexico, Otero-Warren was very successful in parlaying her own political experiences and leveraging her knowledge and connections to effect change. As Whaley puts it, quote, that considerable arm twisting on the part of Nina and others was having a positive effect on the New Mexico legislators in Washington was evident. She had brought to the battle her knowledge of the bureaucracy learned at an early age from her stepfather and uncles. Otero-Warren's ground game was superb, though she was fighting against some very politically dug-in opponents, including Thomas B. Catron, the one-term New Mexico senator who rebuffed all discussion of suffrage. The work of Otero-Warren and her suffrage colleagues to see the state pass its own suffrage legislation was not successful, as in 1917 the state legislature voted down suffrage on a state level again, this time by a very narrow margin of 4 votes. Undeterred, Otero-Warren continued to lobby state legislators and congressmen, becoming more confident and effective. Again, Whaley, quote, Nina had discovered the joy and drama of revolutionary politics and of breaking down stereotypes, and in the process she had learned to trust her own strength and judgment. With the advent of World War I, suffrage voices nationwide took on a different timbre, as many activists, including Otero-Warren, took on multiple civic roles in addition to their advocacy of suffrage. With Erna Ferguson and Alice Corbin Henderson, Otero-Warren collaborated in war efforts, involving herself with the Red Cross in Santa Fe, with war bonds, and other causes. Whaley notes that in 1918, state and federal legislators, perhaps in an attempt to sidestep or ignore or quell suffrage voices, decided to focus on prohibition legislation, which would take effect nationally in 1920 and be repealed 15 years later. Nevertheless, Nina Otero-Warren and others persisted. Eventually, in June 1919, the Congress of the United States of America passed the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, awarding women the right to vote. Of course, this amendment required 36 states to ratify it for it to be enacted as law. And Otero-Warren put shoulder to the wheel in New Mexico to see it happen. Although approval of the constitutional amendment passed the New Mexico House, it failed in the Senate, where a substitute referendum for suffrage was proposed. Does all this sound familiar? This, that, writer, this. Okay. Back to lobbying efforts, and fearful that similar efforts would be successful in other states, Otero-Warren and her suffrage colleagues redoubled efforts. And in February 1920, both houses of the New Mexico State Legislature voted to ratify the 19th Amendment. New Mexico was the 32nd state to vote in favor of amending the Constitution to guarantee women the right to vote. And in 1920, it became so for women throughout the United States. After taking a moment to catch her breath and awaiting the amendment of the New Mexico State Constitution in 1921, permitting women to hold public office, a concept that it seems absurd to have to even be considered, Otero-Warren put both new legal abilities to the work they were intended and tested out her own considerable political pull and acumen. She ran for a congressional seat. Aside from solidifying support from friends and colleagues she had worked with in promotion of suffrage, her first challenge lay within the Republican Party, which was the party that she was affiliated with. Otero-Warren stumped from county to county, traveling by automobile and promoting her political goals and candidacy. She announced her candidacy in various newspapers, including La Revista de Taos, as we can see here, not well, where she expressed her goals in excellent Spanish. And this is one of the things that's fascinating to me, is she is able, this is not the only letter to the editor or publication that she writes and publishes in Spanish. And her Spanish is really good. She writes Old Spain and Our Southwest in English, but for certain types of publications, she writes in Spanish. Otero-Warren writes in extremely articulate Spanish, "Si soy electa, me esmeré en el representar consistentemente los intereses del pueblo de Nuevo México, con especial atención al proyecto de reclamaciones, las cédulas de tarifa, la extensión de necesarios créditos a rancheros y creadores de ganado, la justa liquidación de la deuda que las naciones les deben a aquellos que las defendieron durante la última guerra." So she lays out some national level agendas and some local agendas as well. The candidacy statement goes on to describe other aspects of her platform, especially those promoting the education and well-being of children and families, issues that were dear to her heart. Among these are proposals to appeal to the federal government for support for the state in progresar en materias de educación y en materias de salud y en el bienestar de la niñez, so health and well-being and education for families and children. In advancing child labor laws para hacer efectiva la legislación de la labor de los niños, so against child labor, right, promoting child labor laws or enforcing child labor laws. She closes by acknowledging with graciousness the honor that her nomination and eventual election might bring, and her full intention to do well by the people of New Mexico as an elected official of the state. Si soy la escogida de la Convención Republicana para esta oficina, so this is prior to the Republican primary, consideraré aquello un alto honor y una oportunidad para el servicio. I would consider this a high honor and an opportunity to serve. Of note is that Otero-Warren's Spanish, and there's no indication given in this statement or others that anyone translated for her, is excellent, in spite of the lack of educational opportunities in Spanish in New Mexico during her childhood. Although Otero-Warren's biographer Whaley implies several times that Otero-Warren's family and nuevomexicana background carried the day in terms of her ability to appeal to Indo-Hispano residents of the state, I would argue that without the ability to speak and otherwise communicate proficiently in Spanish, these qualities would otherwise not have been enough for her to be as effective as she was. Her language abilities, as well as the cultural knowledge that accompanied them, were fundamental to her success as a civil servant first, a lobbyist, and a candidate. Otero-Warren handily won the Republican primary against incumbent Congressman Nestor Montoya and began her campaign against John Morrow, the Democratic candidate for the congressional seat. So from primary to actual election. Otero-Warren's candidacy and advocacy was unfolding in a political environment that had been in a push-pull since New Mexico became a territory in 1846 and beyond when it was finally granted statehood in 1912. So all of this is happening pretty quickly after New Mexico becomes a state. So for this reason, a political poem written in support of Otero-Warren by fellow Nuevo Mexicano Felipe Mechacon is all the more fascinating. And that's the poem that I handed out to you in Spanish and in English. And I might ask for your help in just a minute in reading the poem. Chacon himself was a Democrat, and the Democratic Party indeed won the election with Morrow, who defeated Otero-Warren by about 10,000 votes, 59,000 to Nina's 49,000. Among the many interesting elements of this poem is that Chacon lauds Otero-Warren, who is a Republican candidate, even though she was from the opposing party. Let's take a look at this and read this poem about Nina Otero-Warren. So I'm going to need some volunteers. Okay. A la señora Adelina Otero-Warren, candidata republicana para el Congreso 1922.
Ceñida está tu frente de laureles y tu nombre de honores irradia. Hoy se asoma tu estrella en los dinteles de la aurora triunfal de un nuevo día.
El mundo avanza con la idea humana y nacen nuevas cosas en la vida. Hoy refleja la luz de la mañana, en otra esfera la mujer nacida.
Nacida en el sufragio igual al hombre, pero en lo espiritual más elevado. En pureza moral labra su nombre y la tierra va bien en su jornada.
Aquesta evolución tan meritoria, marcando el alto paso del progreso, cubrirá Nuevo México de gloria, poniendo una mujer en el Congreso.
Habilidosa, competente, honrada, de alma gentil, de corazón sincero. Ella ahí, la del pueblo proclamada, la dama típica Adelina Otero.
Vástago noble de español linaje y más aún americana pura, pero ¿qué importa el exterior ropaje del que amerita distinguida altura?
No es exclusiva la grandeza humana, que no limita con nación ninguna. Del alto cielo su poder dimana, y a quien le place su belleza aduna.
Mas no es esta lisonja que motiva el servil interés del egoísmo, que solo encierra mi intención altiva, tener en la justicia un idealismo.
Salud, salud, un brindis de alegría. Placer del progresivo ciudadano os manda junto con la trova mía el saludo de un pueblo soberano. So, and an applause for all of you. Viva Nina Otero-Warren. So I wanted to read the original Spanish because the poem is so cool. But you have the translation with you as well in case you want to move back and forth between the Spanish and the English. So let's take a closer look at the poem and also at its author, Felipe Mechacon, who was Nina Otero-Warren's contemporary and who, as the owner or editor of several Spanish-language newspapers at the start of the 20th century, reported or commented on political happenings in New Mexico, in particular those that impacted the Nuevo Mexicano population. So this poem, for me, is super fascinating. It's the only one like it in his collection, and I'll talk a little bit more about the collection of poems that he published. And he kind of published poems on the side. He wrote poetry on the side in addition to having a job as a newspaper editor, who wrote editorials, who was aware of the political happenings in New Mexico at the time. So like Nina Otero-Warren, Felipe Mechacon, the author of the poem we just read, came from a long line of Nuevo Mexicanos active in the New Mexico political and literary scene. Born in 1873, so a little bit before Nina Otero-Warren, in Santa Fe, Chacon counted among his published relatives his great-uncle Rafael Chacon, who wrote about the arrival of American troops to New Mexico and the transition of power from Mexico to the United States, to his cousin Eusebio Chacon, who was the district attorney for Las Animas County and land grant official in Trinidad, Colorado, and who was known for his dignified and pointed editorial letters in defense of Nuevo Mexicano history and political participation. Chacon's biographer, the New Mexican historian Benjamin Reed, refers to Felipe Chacon's father as El Finado Don Urbano Chacon. At the time of his death, when Felipe Maximiliano Chacon was 13, Urbano Chacon, try to keep track of the Chacones, was the superintendent of schools in Santa Fe and had founded 2 newspapers, one of which, La Aurora, Felipe M. Chacon would later edit. His family's ongoing involvement with New Mexican politics provided Chacon with front-row seat insight into New Mexico's ongoing political situation and positioned him in a manner sympathetic to Nuevo Mexicanos' most pressing issues. And of course, he edited and published and owned Spanish-language newspapers that were intended for a Spanish-language reading community. In addition, Chacon's perfectly symmetrical bilingualism in Spanish and English and his involvement with the local Spanish-language press make his work stand out, even among the important literary figures of his own family. So when Chacon published Poesía y Prosa, which is the book that contains this poem on Nina Otero-Warren, Chacon had already been long involved with the press and literary scene. Reed wrote of him that Chacon es un genio, y como todos los genios, no se sabe estimar a sí mismo. He's a genius, and like all geniuses, he doesn't know how to see that in himself. His work on Otero-Warren is thus part of a larger body of poetry, not all of which was published in his book, that treats not only the maybe to be expected sentimental topics and verse written for family members, but also works on political topics, including poems treating New Mexico's late admission to statehood, admonishments for New Mexico's legislators, and critiques of politicians who Chacon perceived to do no justice to their community. The poem on Otero-Warren's candidacy for Congress is among this group of cantos patrios y misceláneos, or patriotic and miscellaneous verse. So as I mentioned earlier, there are plenty of reasons why Otero-Warren's candidacy received broad support across Nuevo Mexicano political groups and populations. But Chacon imbues his support with the grace and style particular to his poetry, which was predominantly in English, although he wrote some poetry, in Spanish, pardon me, but he also wrote some poetry in English, in his laud of a fellow Nuevo Mexicana who stood on the other side of the political aisle. Because the poem is in Spanish, certain elements, such as Otero-Warren's gender, are implicit in the words themselves, as in the subtitle of the poem, which reads, of course, Candidata Republicana para el Congreso 1922, or Woman Republican Candidate for Congress in 1922. As such, the premise for what is about to follow is implicitly established from the very beginning of the poem. I mean, you could probably figure it out from Nina, but just in case you couldn't. It is about New Mexico's first woman to run for national political office, immediately after women fought for and won the right to vote. As with most of Chacon's poetry, one element that stands out immediately is how Chacon expresses his clearly unequivocal support of Otero-Warren. There's no waffling about whether her gender should inhibit her candidacy and participation in Congress. Her candidacy is described in that second stanza, where he says, El mundo avanza con la idea humana y nacen nuevas cosas en la vida. I love this stanza. Hoy refleja la luz de mañana, en otra esfera la mujer nacida. Right up front. Indeed, Chacon posits a great deal of progressive pride in Otero-Warren's candidacy, asserting that her election as a woman would reflect well on New Mexico and on New Mexicans, saying, Cubrirá Nuevo México de gloria poniendo una mujer en el Congreso. The poem closes with another shout of support to Otero-Warren from the progressive quarter. Un brindis de alegría, placer de progresivo ciudadano, a greeting from un pueblo soberano. Besides showing New Mexico to be politically engaged and consistent with the changing political times and nominating a woman for office, Chacon steps back to implicitly acknowledge women's suffrage efforts that preceded Otero-Warren's nomination, as well as women's fundamental equality with men in matters of governance, and their patent suitability for holding office. Como dice, nacida en el sufragio igual al hombre, pero en lo espiritual más elevada. The combination of praise with acknowledgement of past injustice is not unique in this poem. This is one of Chacon's things that we see typically in the political poetry. Here, Chacon acknowledges that lack of voting rights for women was an equality foisted onto them as they were born into suffrage as men's equal. In other instances in his political poetry, we see where Chacon praises the United States with nationalistic pride, at the same time decreeing the racism and xenophobia that impeded its acceptance as a state for 7 decades. So he does this with other types of poetry, other pieces of poetry as well. Indeed, Chacon draws in the ongoing conversation about nationality present in his other poems, although often couched in the masculine. Here, when discussing Otero-Warren, she is both a vástago noble de español linaje, although she's also más aún americana pura. So this is another sort of identity politics line that he walks in other works of political poetry. Then Chacon moderates the importance of nationality and citizenship altogether, saying, in essence, who cares what her nationality is? ¿Qué importa el exterior ropaje del que amerita distinguida altura? Like, who really cares? She's a really solid person and a really wonderful character. And then that human grandeur has nothing to do with one's country of origin, but rather with what the divine deems worthy, right? No es exclusiva la grandeza humana que no limita con nación ninguna, right? So it doesn't have to do with what country you're from. Del alto cielo su poder dimana y a quien le place su belleza aduna, right? Based on Otero-Warren's personal character and also enhancing it, power from the heavens is showered down on her, power that should, according to Chacon, be channeled into high office. Beyond depicting Otero-Warren as a national political figure representative of women's right to vote and hold office, Chacon considers the specific qualities demonstrating her appropriateness for office. Perhaps referencing her previous political and civic work, Chacon praises Otero-Warren's accomplishments, completed en pureza moral y la tierra va bien en su jornada. She is furthermore habilidosa, competente, honrada. I hope that's on my tombstone. That would be great. De alma gentil, no? De corazón sincero. I'd take that. All qualities that both incur and reflect what Chacon frames as a divine mandate for her as a political candidate. And yet, as remarkable as her moral and personal character is, Otero-Warren is, in these same respects, the nuevomexicana everywoman, the dama típica, a candidate of her people, and also called by them del pueblo proclamada. Right? Chacon declares his support for Otero-Warren not only on the basis of justice, a justice that, according to the proceeding, has to do with the exclusion of women who are born into suffrage the same as men, but also because he envisions a justice tinged with idealism, rather than empty praises and shallow lauds for Otero-Warren. In this poem, he appears to see not only an excellent candidate, but a corrective to past regressive views of women voters and of women in elected office. Que solo encierra mi intención altiva, teñir en la justicia un idealismo. So apart from the political and ideological messages about Otero-Warren embedded in the poem, Chacon writes his support in extremely elegant literary verse, and this is not some sort of political jingle barked from a street corner. It's rather a carefully crafted piece of literary art intended to lift up a candidate and sway an audience. As we can see with the strict attention to form, in which Chacon excelled, the poem follows classic Spanish versification and rhyme scheme for a type of poem called the cervantesio. So he's very good in his poetry about following rules for Spanish poetic forms, right? Like we have in English like a sonnet, or I'm sorry, I'm not very good with English poetic forms, but forms that sort of create a set of rules that are a challenge to the poet to create art within those rules. He does the same thing with with Spanish forms of poetry. So I can tell you a little bit about it, but he follows these 11 syllable verses, follows a very strict rhyme scheme, and Gustavo Adolfo Becker, the renowned Spanish romantic poet, was an expert at the cervantesio, and here's one of his. Que decir de aquel sucio político que con su ardiente discurso embriaga los oídos del ingenuo público que alivio busca la vida acaiga. So of course, Chacon's arguing the opposite of this, but I thought it was kind of funny. Anyway, Chacon uses all of his considerable poetic skills to say just the opposite of political candidate Otero-Warren, as if the rigorous stylistics of the poem were not themselves a sufficiently painstaking show of support. The poetic language Chacon chooses in lauding Otero-Warren reveals not only poetic expression, but also grace and selectivity. From the very beginning of the poem, Otero-Warren's brow is crowned with laurels, and her name radiates honor. She is compared to a rising star over a dawning new day. A more evocative suite of metaphors could hardly be desired for any candidate, but for Otero-Warren, the elevated but not quite over-the-top language is perfection. Chacon goes on to describe her with adjectives described previously: honorable, accomplished, capable, of graceful soul and sincere heart. The allegories Chacon employs in describing Otero-Warren are well within keeping of those he uses in his other poems, including other political works, and the poem has the same slight starch he used in a poem praising Octaviano Larrazolo or describing New Mexico's statehood. Ornate but not gaudy, admiring but not flattering, directly political but a velvet hammer rather than a clanging gong. Although A la Señora Adelina Otero-Warren is by no means the only example of a text supporting Otero-Warren's for candidacy, its frankness is echoed in newspaper editorials and in the support she received from many quarters, sometimes outside of New Mexico. Here in an article in the September 1922 Omaha, Nebraska Bee, a brief article discussing Otero-Warren's primary victory over Nestor Montoya names New Mexico as the latest state to wheel into line with a woman candidate for Congress. It's kind of like here. One day I will learn how to highlight text. The brief news piece praises Otero-Warren for her victory over Montoya, noting that, quote, her compelling victory is notable because of the admitted popularity of the man she defeated. He was elected to Congress 2 years ago by the largest plurality ever given a candidate for the office in New Mexico, and the selection of Mrs. Otero-Warren is therefore the more impressive. The article closes with high hopes for her victory in the congressional election, commenting explicitly not only on her gender, but also on her Spanish bilingualism, which is here seen for the good. Quote, it is not unreasonable to expect that Miss Alice, another female congressional candidate, will not be lonesome in the next Congress, for she will have a colleague not only of her sex, but speaking as well the language of the Great Southwest. In Taos, the Republican-oriented Revista de Taos expressed support for Otero-Warren's candidacy as a Republican candidate for Congress. Not only does the newspaper name her many civic and political positions, it comments explicitly on her involvement in the advancement of suffrage in New Mexico as Presidenta de los Clubes de Federación de Mujeres del Estado durante la campaña a favor del sufragio de la mujer en Nuevo México, gracias a cuyos esfuerzos se debe el triunfo en el Estado de esta medida. The article goes on to say how her proven leadership in the past should leave no doubt as to her future abilities in high office, and specifically talks about her as a female congresswoman as demostraría que la energía, la dignidad, la inteligencia o sabiduría no son solo propias del varón hispano, sino de la mujer de esta raza. El triunfo de la señora Otero-Warren es necesario para el más grande orgullo de Nuevo México y de la raza hispana, especialmente al referirnos al sexo mujeril que debe ver en el triunfo de Nina Otero-Warren una de sus mayores glorias. Clearly, although the Revista de Taos was biased towards Republican candidates, this is a Republican slate of candidates, its support of Otero-Warren was also based on gender, and not, as detractors who worked against her suggested by dragging her short-lived marriage into the conversation, a negative characteristic. After vigorous campaign, however, Otero-Warren lost the election to the Democratic candidate at a time when the two parties were shifting in terms of their racial composition and predominance in New Mexico. As some political historians of New Mexico have noted, the 1922 election, to which Otero-Warren's candidacy pertained, was the beginning of a move from many New Mexicans towards the Democratic Party. In any event, Otero-Warren did not lose by a huge margin, in particular, as biographer Whaley notes, because she was, quote, the first woman to challenge an all-male political system, and that year the Democrats elected as governor James Hinkle and most of the state officials. Despite the lack of female political role models before Nina's campaign, and with no tradition of participation in structured party politics, Hispanic women had quickly become active voters, and most had voted for her, end quote. Though the loss must have come as a disappointment to Otero-Warren, Whaley further notes of the 1920 amendment securing women's right to vote, citing cultural critic Vivian Gornick, that it resulted in women being released from a collective lifetime of silence, and that those with brains and visionary ideas were no longer considered eccentric, and many had discovered a sustaining inner clarity and strength, end quote. Otero-Warren did not rest for long, nor did she run again for federal office, though she did help her brother Manuel Otero run for governor in 1924. In fact, she continued to be who she was in her many different facets, advocating for educational reforms for adults and children in New Mexico, buying a homestead property outside of Santa Fe and operating it with her friend Mamie Meters, and continuing to be the heart and legal guardian of her family's home in Santa Fe, where her numerous siblings, their children, and her stepfather moved through. Once her homestead called Las Dos was established, Otero-Warren began work in the mid-1930s on a book through which I met her, Old Spain in Our Southwest, which was published by HBJ in 1936. And here's the book. Well, this is actually a reprint. This is a facsimile of the original printing. But I'm happy to pass that around. I'm sure there's a copy here, probably several. Otero-Warren had been encouraged by friends in the literary community in Santa Fe and elsewhere to write about her memories of New Mexico daily life and culture from the time of her childhood in Los Lunas, and the stories and practices she recalled. Literary scholar Diana Rebolledo grouped Otero-Warren's writing with that of two other Nuevo Mexicana writers of the epoch, who also sought to write down and preserve their history, stories, and cultural values as they remembered them. Cleofas Jaramillo, in her various books, especially Sombras del Pasado and Romance of a Little Village Girl, and Fabiola Cabeza de Vaca Gilbert's We Fed Them Cactus. All three women were born in the 19th century, and Cabeza de Vaca Gilbert was the youngest of the three, and all were involved in what Rebolledo terms the, quote, cultural flourishing of northern New Mexico literary scene. Rebolledo, in her examination of the three authors, brought them back into a literary conversation from which they had been excluded, primarily for ascribing to Spanish identifiers within their writing. More recent critiques, such as the forthcoming book, With You and Impressed by La Finada Doctora Laura Padilla, reads these texts with new eyes, great humor, and perspicacity. Old Spain in our Southwest is a fascinating compilation of several different types of information. The first are historical reflections presented through the lens of Spanish colonial history in New Mexico, with all the exclusivist and racial problems this entails in her writing and elsewhere. This is followed by descriptions of day-to-day life in New Mexico, including celebrations like saints' days and feasts, and certain concepts that have particular value in New Mexico, such as Otero-Warren's description of water here. And she says, water actually means the livelihood of the people, not only food, the product of gardens and fields, but all that their surplus may be exchanged for. So water is carefully guarded and saved. There's little wonder that the saints are taken into the field that they may intercede for the farmer and that God in his mercy may send rain. Water is sacred indeed. End quote. In exploring these fundamental concepts, Otero-Warren focuses on specific historical aspects pertaining to New Mexico, including the explanation of various place names, the history of La Conquistadora, now Nuestra Señora de la Paz, the patrona of the St. Francis Cathedral in Santa Fe, and some background on schooling in New Mexico. The book's final section recounts songs and stories from New Mexico's past, quoting Chilean Nobel Prize-winning poet Gabriela Mistral, and citing examples from New Mexico's trova of ballads in verse, as well as what might be considered folk stories. Rebolledo says of Old Spain in the Southwest that it, quote, communicates to us Otero-Warren's growing sense of disjunction from the landscape, illustrating her feeling of alienation and isolation in a time of transition, and considers the work, along with Jaramillo and Cabeza de Vaca Gilbert's writing, an early attempt to preserve in literary images a vanishing way of life. In addition to this, and to the articulation of many women in the book who exert considerable social power, and of the display of social cultural tensions in New Mexico, we see the humor that typified Nuevo Mexicano life, as in the conclusion of the story, The Beggar, or the explanation of the origin of the Garrapata name for the Garrapata Canyon near Taos. In the glossary, English and Spanish intersect in the expressions she records, like ay pope, meaning their puppy. We see regionalisms in her explanation of caída de la tierra, which she explains, of course, means torque or turkey, or guajalote, no? And she shares offhandedly expressions such as ni con jabón de la Puebla, to say something so dirty that not even soap from a soap town could clean it, or tan tonto como un burro. There's a lot of little humor that she sneaks in the book in ways that you have to sit down and be quiet with the book to hear. In short, Otero-Warren's literary career, which was not limited to Old Spain in our Southwest, shared many of the same entrepreneurial and far-sighted characteristics as her previous and ongoing political and civic work. So as I said, Old Spain in our Southwest is how I met Nina Otero-Warren, but by researching this talk, I got to know her much better. Her multifaceted self, suffrage and political candidacy included as major elements of an already remarkable life. Otero-Warren went on for many more years to successfully helm her real estate business, to be the matriarch of a family in which she had no children of her own, but who she supported financially, including being the legal head of household for her stepfather, the former nanny who she supported well past the time when the nanny was supporting children of the family, her sisters, including a sister who was born with developmental difficulties who she made sure was taken care of, her other unmarried sister, and legally. And she continued to be a lively voice, not only as a fixture on Santa Fe's increasingly heterogeneous social scene, but who continued to advocate for women's rights, educational advancements, and the well-being of her family. She died in her home just before church and after a tipple of brandy on January 3rd, 1965. Nina Otero-Warren was a true Nuevo Mexicana Mujerota in terms of being a strong woman who can do a lot of different things. So, and as such, I wanted to share with you an image of Nina in her later years, which Dr. Lamadrid and I included in an article on nuevomexicana Mujerotas, and which kind of summarizes the long line of such women that counted Nina Otero-Warren among their numbers. Here you can see Otero-Warren in 1949 at a party she hosted at the McGoffin home in Santa Fe, which was soon after demolished to make a parking lot for the La Fonda Hotel. The costume party was themed as a 19th century gambling salon. And Otero-Warren dressed up as Maria Gertrudis de Barceló, better known in her day as La Tules, the controversial proprietor of a well-known 19th century casino and brothel in Santa Fe. La Tules herself was a powerful social and political figure of her day, owning her property and directing her business affairs with aplomb. In evoking La Tules, Otero-Warren reminded nuevomexicanos of their histories and of the mujerotas that have always been in their midst. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna, for a terrific presentation. I had a comment and then a question. I take a little bit of issue with Diana Rebolledo's statement that somehow she, as a writer, as a person, was dissociating or disconnected with the landscape. I remember her real estate dealings, you could call them that. She acquired a homestead northwest of Santa Fe. That's where Las Dos, where the house was located. And one of the first things she did is put a fence around the entire acreage, and she got, which kept all of the cattle out. Mm-hmm. And she encouraged she encouraged Aldo Leopold early on to keep track of what happens when the cows are gone. Mm-hmm. And that was one of his first projects at looking at landscape recovery in terms of the species, the biota and everything. So just that comment. And then a question, would she have lost that election if they hadn't done that smear on her, saying that her husband was not dead, that he was alive, and she was not truthful about that? Mm-hmm. Do you know who perpetrated that? It must have been some Democrat, and not in today's Democrats. I mean, right. The Republicans back then were the party of Lincoln. They were the party of anti-slavery, and so we need to keep that in mind. But who was it? I don't know.
I don't know.
It lost her the election, I think.
But I remember that being said about her, that it wasn't so much that that she was no longer living with her husband. It was that somehow she had lied about this thing that would be very shameful for somebody, right? To know that you married somebody who lied to you when you got married, and was a bigamist. He had a common law wife, if not a legal wife, in the Philippines. So it's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine what you would do with that when you come back to Santa Fe and you re-enter with your family in the same scene that you were in before. What do you do with that information? And then to bring it out during the campaign as something that somehow should speak to her ability or as a leader. Of course, 100 years later now seems almost it seems very absurd at this particular moment. And when I was looking through the Whaley biography, she said, Aldo Leopold was her favorite brother-in-law, the one that she enjoyed having conversations with, and they had a good personal relationship, in addition to working on on conservation, which is extremely important, obviously.
Was this beautiful poem ever put to a canción, like they used to do canciones?
I don't know. That's an excellent question.
Because, they would write the poetry and then put it to, they already had the lyrics. They'd put it to music and they would sing it at different kinds of festivities or whatever. But this would have been a great campaign kind of thing.
No, but now I'm curious to start looking. I don't know the answer, but now I will look.
Did she date any other men, or was there anything else said about her involvement with other men or women, for that matter?
Well, she had a long-term friend, Mamie Meters, and they actually had 2 houses on the Las Dos homestead, 2 separate houses from what I understand from her biography. But no, she said, well, it's not clear to me from reading, and I'm not sure how, I guess you could look up divorce records in Santa Fe. I'm not sure I don't know if she was divorced.
It was an oath.
Or if she was just separated and they'd no longer live together, in which case it would be difficult for her to, well, even impossible for her to remarry. And unseemly maybe for her to date. I don't have a very good answer.
I don't want to hog this, but I just want to say something about my childhood. A big compliment in our household was when my grandmother would say, "Ah, que niña tan mujerota."
Really?
Yeah.
What did that mean?
It means a woman, a young girl that's willing to get in there and do her stuff, that she's a woman. You know, a mujerota means a woman who does things as a mover or whatever. But that was a great compliment from my grandmother when she would say, "Ah, que niña tan mujerota."
I love that. Thank you for sharing that.
So you briefly mentioned her, I don't want to say relationship, but the tension between her and Thomas B. Catron. While you were doing this research, what did you find about that kind of friction?
Well, the bit that's mentioned in the book is that he, in the biography of Nina Otero-Warren, has to do with, it's a little bit complicated because I think he advocated at some point for one of the cases having to do with the family land grant. He was the lawyer at one point for their side of the family, which this chunk of the estancia land grant was, of course, like lost. It was declared to belong to neither the Mexican land grant nor the Spanish land grant, and therefore to neither of the claimants. And then when it came to discussing suffrage, in the book he's described as saying, like, absolutely not, that's ridiculous. I will not advocate for that on a national level. And turning back women with sort of deprecating comments about what they should be doing instead of voting or running for office.
I'm just curious if she had any like specific responses to him, right?
Ooh, I don't know, but that would, I bet in his archive of correspondence that would be really interesting to look in. And he, he's only elected once. He got the Senate office once and then out.
Is there a historic monument to her in New Mexico? I know they added a bunch for women a few years ago because they discovered there weren't any, and I bet there's one for her.
Does anybody know? Yes, Anna? Could you tell us a bit about it?
No, but we have a book on it.
Okay, so there's a book on it, which we can look for. See.
There's also a mural of her down on Central and Second.
Central and Second. Is that her? Yeah. Oh, wow.
What building?
Or just
Oh,
by
yeah.
that parking lot. I think it was, what's the name of that public art project that, Working Classroom, I think, did that mural.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's good to know. So she is here.
She's right down the street, yeah.
And with Aldo Leopold just down the bosque.
You know, since you're going to have the Hispanic Women's Council, they published a book called Las Mujeres Valerosas. I'm not sure whether she's in that. I can't recall.
Valerosas.
Las Mujeres Valerosas. And I don't know if this library has it.
Yeah,
Is her name in it, by the way?
I think so.
Oh, well, that's good.
I think it's Nuestras Mujeres Valerosas. Yeah.
Okay. Nuestras mujeres valerosas. Okay, I'm writing all the notes down. Okay.
Actually, that is going to be the center point of the February 8th La Canoa talk. So Vanji Zamora, the author of that book, will be here.
Well, I thank everybody for your questions, for your participation, for the wonderful information you shared, which has me writing notes and thinking about what to look for next, and for being here this afternoon.